The Holy Gospel for the day is taken from the 21st chapter of the Gospel according to St. John. I wonder if you know that the Greek word for resurrection is the word anastasis, and it means stand up. I'm going to invite you to stand in reverence and witness to the risen Christ. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said this to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Let us pray for the blessing of the Spirit. Come, Lord, send your Spirit to be among us. Be in our hearts, be around us, surround us, that this word would be your word to us, and that we would open ourselves up to hear from you. Amen. Chippy the parakeet never knew what hit him. The reporter who covered the story reported it this way. Chippy's owner one day decided that she would clean the cage with the vacuum cleaner. So she took the attachment off the hose and she stuck the hose in there. Right about that time, the phone rang. And so she reached around to pick it up, and she was just finished saying hello when Chippy went up into the vacuum cleaner. So she hung up the phone and turned off the vacuum cleaner and opened up the bag, and sure enough, there was Chippy, stunned but alive. Now she realized that he was covered with dust and all the gunk that gets into a vacuum cleaner, and so she rushed him right into the bathroom and turned the water on and stuck him under the water. And then she realized that he was shivering. So she did what any good pet owner would do. She grabbed the hairdryer and blew him dry. A few days afterwards, the reporter called her to find out how Chippy was getting along. She said, He doesn't sing much anymore. He just sort of sits there and stares. Honestly, I think that's how the disciples must have felt. I can't get it back, can I? I think that's how the disciples must have felt after the death of Jesus. Like they'd been put through the ringer, like they didn't know what to do. They lost their voice. Everything was so disconcerting and so strange. How could they know how to be and what to do? And in fact, that we do know, that they had a period of time in which they just couldn't sing out the gospel. And that's what's so compelling about trying to understand what it was that changed, that made them go from those who were terrified and stunned to those who could stand on a street corner and proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, knowing that it could possibly, and that in fact it ended up doing so, costing them their lives. And if you really want to know the truth about the gospel reading for today, it is a reading which actually is talking about the kind of transition that took place in the lives of these followers of Jesus, that made them go from stunned and immobilized and silent to those who got their voice and began once again to sing the truth of the gospel. The book of John tells us that the disciples had gone fishing in the Sea of Galilee. Now, what that really is saying to us is that they went back to what they knew before all this Jesus stuff happened to them. And I think that's just a lot like what we do. When things are hard and difficult, we don't know what to do, we often revert back to the way things were in our lives before we really knew Jesus. But Jesus comes to the shore, and he calls out to these guys. They don't know it's Jesus, but he calls out to them, "You didn't catch any fish." They said, "No, we didn't catch any fish." And he says to them, "Go out and drop the net on the right side of the boat." And they do that. And they catch so many fish, they really can't get it into the boat. They can barely drag it along. It's just so many fish. Now, it's really silly and foolish for us to think that these experienced fishermen had not thought to fish on the right side of the boat. This tells us that this catch of fish comes from Jesus. They all know it's from the influence of the guy who was standing on the shore saying to them, "Drop the net now on the right side of the boat." The beloved disciple recognizes, understands that it has to be the Lord for this to happen. And so he says, "Oh, it's the Lord." And Simon Peter, when he hears that, does what Simon Peter always does. He jumps into the boat and swims to the shore. Now, for the curious among you, a little side note to this is, the text says he got dressed for he was naked. Well, the Greek there, actually, ancient nakedness wasn't what we think of it being today. It probably means that he was wearing just a fisherman's tunic, no underwear, and no belt. Now, I just want you to imagine for a second what happens if somebody just wearing a tunic jumps into the lake without any belt to secure it. So what the text really means is that he puts on a belt to secure his garment, and then he swims ashore. And when he gets ashore, he must certainly have recognized that it was Jesus, but he doesn't say anything about that. And pretty soon all the rest of them come, and they bring in this big catch of fish, and they count it. This is not a regular kind of fishing trip. They count it, and it's 153 fish. And it's odd that we would be given that detail, isn't it? We don't really need that detail for the story to make sense. They could have just said it was a big catch of fish. So we have to try and discern why they give us such a detail. Well, some scholars have said it's the sum of all the numbers from 1 to 17, and you don't have to do it. I did. It is. You add them all together, and it comes up to 153, although who knows what that means. The predominant thought is that the people of that time thought that there were 153 different nations in the world, and that probably represents the whole world. Whatever it means literally, what it meant to them was not a regular fishing excursion, but a mandate from Jesus to go out and bring and make disciples of the whole world. That's what they're supposed to do with this. They're to go out and make disciples of the whole world. And I want you to notice that even though that net is so full they can barely drag it ashore, it doesn't break. And that was to tell them that as different as all these people were from all these different nations, it's Jesus who draws them. And it means that they won't break the community. And it means, therefore, that we have no reason to be afraid of those who are different from us that the Lord sends to us. There's no reason for that. Jesus is fishing them. Jesus is bringing them. And it's not going to hurt us to open our arms and be inclusive of all people who come to us. So after they count the fish, they realize this breakfast that's been cooking on the shore there, that's for them. Jesus has been cooking for them. In other words, first he gives them a mission, and then he nourishes them so that they'll be able to go and do the mission. In the Korean community, there's a tradition called ricing the community. And it means that when someone comes, they give them some rice. It's an indication that they're going to feed them, but it's more than a physical feeding. It's a way of saying, this is where you're from. This is who you are. This is your identity. You're a part of this family. It remembers them, places them once again into the community. It is a way of saying, we have given you the identity of one who is connected to us. This is your family. This is your identity. So that when a person gets riced in that community, it not only feeds their bodies, but it's a way of feeding their spirit and their personhood. They have been riced. It means they belong. They are a part of this community. What Jesus is doing here is he is ricing the disciples. He is reminding them, yes, you don't know what you're supposed to do now. In light of my death and resurrection, you're confused. You thought you had life figured out. You thought you knew what you were supposed to do with your life, but now everything is different. Now I'm telling you, everything that you do comes out of your identity in me. You're my family. You belong to me. You are a part of what I am doing. I nurture you. I nourish you for that. I give you your identity and your personhood, and it is out of that you go forth into a world that will reject you, but doesn't matter because I'm fishing for those folks too. And I want us also to notice that the food that Jesus gives that day is very like the food of the feeding of the 5,000. That is to say, it's bread and fish. It means for us that every time we feast with the risen Christ, we are experiencing a miracle. And I pray for you that you will realize that when you come to the table today. A miracle is happening in your life. You're being riced. God is bringing you to everything that you need for nourishment and also your identity, and to nourish your spirit and your soul and tell you who you are in this mixed up world. In the midst of everything that doesn't make sense around you, you know who you are because you know whose you are, and that is a miracle. So it turns out that the response that came to the disciples, that transformed them from stunned, silent, terrified, not singing folk to those who could go out and proclaim the gospel in a world that was dangerous, was first of all knowing that they saw and knew the risen Christ, that he was their identity, and that he sent them on a mission. And their mission would not be done alone, for he was going with them, nurturing them and nourishing them all along. Now, we could stop there. We could leave the text there if we wanted to. It's just that Jesus doesn't, so we won't either. Because there's another very important piece to this text that follows this breakfast, this coming together of identity, this understanding of who you are now in light of the risen Christ. And that is that Jesus now deals with Peter and his situation. He says to Peter, "Do you love me, Simon?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus says, "Go feed my sheep." And he says it a second time. And then he asks the very same question a third time. And this time, Peter is hurt by the question. He's sad. Now, we are to understand that it's not because Peter's worried that Jesus doesn't know that he loves him. In fact, Peter's response is, "You know everything. You know that I love you." The reason this brings sadness to Peter is that it is a reminder of the 3 times he denied Jesus in a very important conversation before Jesus was executed. And Jesus knows that he has to get past his guilt and shame over that, or he's not going to be able to continue in the identity as follower of Christ that Jesus wants to give him. It's a reminder to us that one of the most wonderful responses that we can make to the presence of the risen Christ in our midst and the nourishment that he brings us and all of the blessings that come to us through him is to let go of those old guilts and shames that immobilize us and keep us from moving forward into what God is calling us to do and into who God is calling us to be. And Jesus knows very well Peter's going to need that. Because he says to him, when you were young, you did what you wanted to do. You fastened your own belt, you went where you wanted to go. Just as he'd fastened his own belt to get out of the boat into the water. Jesus says, when you're old, you'll stretch out your arms, and someone else will fasten your belt and take you where you do not want to go. Now, I want you just to imagine this. Stretch out your arms. Someone else fastening your belt, taking you where you do not want to go, is an image for crucifixion. Jesus is saying to Peter, you're going to have the same fate that I had. And church tradition is that Peter did indeed die in crucifixion, except that he didn't think it was appropriate to die in the exactly same way as Jesus did, so he insisted that he be crucified upside down. And in the category for what it is worth, there are a set of bones in the Vatican, in the vault under the Vatican, that are claimed to be the bones of Peter, and modern forensics tell us that the injuries to the bones are consistent with a person who was executed on a cross upside down. Peter is going to need to get past his brokenness, his guilt, and his shame, just like all of us are going to need to get past the things that are wrong in our lives. The brokenness, the hurt, the shame, the things that we've done that we just can't imagine could be forgiven. All of that, we have to let that go. Because the Lord of life who stands in our midst risen is one who calls us into newness. And this motivation that gives us our call and our mission and our nourishment is a motivation that may sometimes bring us into a time of suffering. It may sometimes make us feel like we've been sucked into a vacuum cleaner, brushed off in a faucet, and blown dry. But it is still God's call, and it is still what we are being sent to do, in spite of the possibility that it might make us suffer a little bit. In the 19th century, there was a missionary to Molokai in the Hawaiian Islands by the name of Joseph Damien. Damien was serving a leper colony there. He'd been there for quite a while. The people absolutely loved and revered him. And one day he was preparing for their daily worship, and he was making something hot in a cup, and he poured the water. You know how sometimes when you pour into a rounded cup, it'll sort of splash back up? It sloshed out of the cup onto his foot, and he didn't feel anything. It took him a few moments to realize that he hadn't felt anything. And then with terror, he tests his concern. Hands shaking, he deliberately poured scalding water on his foot. No sensation at all. He knew exactly what that meant. Most people that morning missed his traditional opening to the sermon. He generally opened the sermon with "my fellow believers." That day, he opened the sermon with "my fellow lepers." Sometimes the call to which God brings us calls us into places where we will experience the same fate as those that we go to feed. And yet that is our call, to care and tend and feed others as Jesus would have loved them, and to witness to a broken world. That's what we're called to do. That's your call and mine. You have been riced. Will you let it change you?